Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today on the podcast, we are so thrilled to have with us Donald Kalsched. We've wanted to get him on the podcast for a long time, and we've finally pinned him down. Don has been one of our great teachers and mentors throughout our training, and he is a world expert in trauma and has a very important and I would say kind of seminal theory of trauma that we're going to be talking about today. He's a clinical psychologist and Jungian analyst in private practice in Brunswick, Maine, where he's also a member of the Maine Jung Center and the C.G. Jung Institute of New England. And of course, he's also associated with our institute, the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, where he teaches and supervises candidates in training. He's the author of many journal articles, book chapters, interviews, and two major books. The first is The Inner World of Trauma, Archetypal Defenses of the Personal Spirit, that was published in 1996 and really kind of transformed the field. And more recently, Trauma and the Soul, a Psychospiritual Approach to Human Development and Its Interruption, and that was published in 2013. Both of these books have been translated into many languages. Don teaches and lectures nationally and internationally, and is pursuing his interdisciplinary interest in early trauma and dissociation theory and its mythopoetic manifestations in the mythic and religious iconography of many cultures. And I know this is going to be a really fabulous episode, and I'll just say now for those who want to see and hear more from Don, he has a couple of events coming up. At the end of September, so September 29th through October 2nd, 2022, Don will be doing an online program called Our Polarized Culture, Healing in the Individual and the Collective. And this is an online program that's open to the public. We'll have links in the show notes where you can purchase tickets. And then in November, he will be participating in the Fay Lectures in Houston. And these will be in person in Houston at the C.G. Jung Center, but they will also be available online, and these are free. The title of those talks is Opening the Closed Heart, Meetings with the Human and Archetypal Child in the Psychotherapy of Early Trauma. And Don has let us know that this is the material that will be in his third book. So if you would like a preview of that book, which I'm sure will likewise be very important, this is a wonderful free opportunity.
Just so people know this, in the show notes, the link will be www.donaldkalsched.com, where all the information that Lisa just related is available.
Don, thank you so much for joining us, and we're thrilled to have you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate it very much. I've been wanting to be on the podcast for some time, and finally it's happening.
I want to relate, Don, the story of how I first encountered you and your work. At the time, I was a social worker working in community mental health in Pittsburgh, and I was part of the Jung seminar there. And they had invited you to come and teach that weekend. And one of my eye-opening revelations in community mental health was the extent to which clients related stories of sometimes truly horrific childhood trauma, and to an extent that I had not known existed so frequently and so severely in America. And perhaps I was terribly innocent or naive about that. But I had started to read everything I could get my hands on about trauma. And despite some really good stuff, it didn't click until you came to Pittsburgh to teach. And your book was just out, The Inner World of Trauma. And it was just monumental for me of that this was it. This was the understanding that I had been looking for. So now you have a second book and a third book on the way, and let's talk about trauma and your understanding of it that so revolutionized the field.
Well, thanks, Deb. The first book, The Inner World of Trauma, was written in 1996 by Routledge and published by Routledge. It followed my experience in the 80s, in the 1980s. You know, trauma was not really talked about much. There's a whole trauma paradigm that's emerged in the last 40 years, certainly, starting with Judith Herman's work, not starting with that, but she was seminal in introducing childhood trauma to the field. I was introduced to trauma in the following way. I was a Jungian analyst. I was new in practice in New York. And a lot of my patients, it turned out, were presenting dreams to me of persecution, violent attack on the dream ego by parts of the psyche that seemed to be archetypal. They were men in black, monstrous figures, and so on. And so I got very interested in that. And it wasn't only the presence of violence, but the presence of violence in relationship, it seemed to me, to something extremely vulnerable and open in the personality. Almost all my patients that fit the trauma description were highly sensitive people in Elaine Aron's characterization. In other words, they were very tuned in to their inner feelings. They were very vulnerable, very fragile, very sensitive, poetic individuals. And so it was that very vulnerability in them that seemed to be under attack. And I'll remember one case in particular stands out in my memory. It was a woman who was seeing me for no particular reason except vague depression, and she was in her 60s at the time. She had a feeling that her life didn't quite make sense. And so as we started to unpack her history, it turned out that she was brought up in great luxury, but turns out emotional poverty. So a lot of individuals who suffer from early childhood trauma, and that is my specialty, by the way, not later adult trauma, although I've certainly seen a lot of people with adult trauma. But what's interested me is how the very early trauma in childhood can influence a whole lifetime of symptomatology, of psychopathology. Anyway, this woman, her mother happened to be dying at the time. She was in her 90s, and my patient was cleaning out her house, and she found some old movies of her own childhood, and she got them onto, at the time it was DVDs. No, not DVDs, but VCRs. Remember the old VCR machines? This dates the therapy. So she put them on a VCR, and I suggested, and then she watched them, and she said she couldn't sleep that night because of what she saw of her own childhood self. And so I suggested that she bring in the VCR, and we watched it together. And in this 8mm movie, now transported into VCR, there was a wedding, and she was 2 years old, and she was running around. She was being photographed by apparently her father, running around from one pair of legs to the next, imploring the adults to pick her up. She was being ignored, and she was being ignored and again and again until she became quite frantic. Now, it's hard to imagine that the father who was filming this wouldn't have intervened, but finally she ended up in the dust, pounding her little fists in the dust, completely disconsolate, completely abandoned, completely undone. And the patient started tearing up when she saw this, and so did I. Mm. And so it wasn't just that we were watching a moment of her childhood in video, mm-hmm. but it was the fact that something new was happening in the transference, in the relationship with my patient. And it was very moving for both of us. And she was quite affected by this, and more than the movie. She went home that night and wrote in her journal a long note to me about how grateful she was about this moment. And And the words kept going through her mind, you affected him, you affected him. And he cares about you. So that night, she had the following dream. 2 women, long since separated, sisters, are going to be reunited after many, many years. And they're going to meet on the upper level of a staircase that's shaped like a uterus, like the Gone with the Wind staircase. Do you remember
the
those?
fallopian tubes.
Remember that one? Fallopian tubes, right? And one sister is waiting up above, full of anticipation and excitement. She's dressed in red. The other sister is coming to meet her up the right-hand staircase, dressed in green. As the second sister approaches up the staircase, a man parts a curtain, man dressed in black, brings out a shotgun, blows her away in the face, and she tumbles down the stairs, red and green, red and green, red and green. Where the woman up above, seeing this, is so horrified that she can't contain herself and she vomits over the staircase. End of dream. Now, I had a lot of trouble putting that dream together with my classical Jungian training.
Sure.
Because I had always understood that parts of the psyche, they may come up in conflict with each other in dreams, but generally the understanding was that the psyche wanted to integrate, that parts of the psyche wanted to pull together and integrate to create a greater sense of wholeness. And this was clearly not the case in this dream. It was clear that one part of the psyche was an anti-life force. And when I say that, I mean, I don't think this part wanted to actually kill the vulnerable feminine, but what I've come to see is this theme of death in dreams caused by these men in black, these dark figures. The effort is to kill connections to that part. The effort is to kill consciousness of the vulnerability. So that's what I came to understand was going on here. So I became aware that, okay, there seem to be in the psyche defenses against the vulnerable possibilities of healing. That isn't in Jung. So if there's an anti-healing force in the psyche called a defense, and if that's starting to be represented in dreams, then we have something really remarkable that might need to augment Jungian theory. In other words, there are seemingly archetypal defenses against the very parts of us that are required to emerge and come into being in relationship in order for us to heal. So I started to read a lot of what the psychoanalytic literature called resistance to healing. And this all falls under the category of resistances to healing. And lo and behold, many other therapists before me were talking about this. They were talking about an internal saboteur that attacked a libidinal ego. That's Fairbairn's language. And other people were talking about the same thing. I got very interested in the fact that there was precedent for these ideas, but they just had not found their way into Jungian theory. So my first book was called The Inner World of Trauma, Archetypal Defenses Against the Personal Spirit. Now, I use the personal spirit as an image of that vulnerable, childlike, seeking, reaching out, longing for connection, attachment part of us that wants to reach out, and the defense says never again, because the defense has been there, came into being when that child was massacred so many times early on, and the defense is not evil. The defense is simply trying to prevent this childlike part of the psyche from ever re-experiencing that traumatic pain. So the defenses are trying to regulate how much pain can be experienced by the ego. So it's a self-regulatory, affect-regulatory system, and I called it the self-care system. And I've come to see it as composed mostly of this attacking violent energy and an inner child, but it's more complicated than that, because I then came to realize that paired with the attacking violent energy was, those of you who have seen my second book and heard me talk about this know that I talk about violence on the one hand, but illusion on the other. So there's a dark angel and a bright angel in the self-care system. Illusion is the bright angel's effort to create altered states, addictive states, oblivion, in order to cast a spell over the traumatized ego and make sure it doesn't experience its feeling. So I'll end this little homily by saying that trauma is the fact that all of us are given more to experience in this life than we can bear to experience consciously. Now, that's on a spectrum, right? I mean, some of us are given more to experience than we can bear to even entertain at all in consciousness. So when the unmetabolizable, unbearable pain is experienced in early childhood, what we discover is that very primitive archetypal defenses emerge to prevent this experience from being experienced. Okay, now how do you prevent experience from being experienced by a child? Well, the short answer to that is that you chop it up. You chop up experience into components, and you disseminate those components to different parts of the psyche soma. So affect in the body is sent to the body, or what we call the somatic unconscious. Images in the mind are sent to the mind. The memory of the actual event goes into some other pocket compartment in the psyche, and those parts don't join up to make whole experience, and you need whole experience to have conscious experience. So a trauma survivor will have flashbacks of images without feeling, or feeling without images. And this is what Jung discovered, by the way. Jung had this experience of having emotions without images when, in 1912, he suffered his sort of breakdown after the rejection of Freud. And he had to practice yoga exercises, he said, because the emotions were overwhelming and he was afraid of a psychosis. And those yoga exercises and his attending to the unconscious and finding images in the emotions saved him. Because once he had the images in the emotions, he was beginning to have whole experience. And whole experience then can lead to integration. Fragmented shards of experience, which is what Jung started with, do not lead to integration. They just go round and round and round and round and round. That's a definition of trauma that we can all get a hold of. The defenses that render impossible experience unconscious are called dissociation. And I've written a number of papers on dissociation and Jung. Jung had all the tools for this understanding. He talked about dissociation a lot. And his whole complex theory is, in a way, a trauma history, a trauma theory. Because he said, look, the psyche is built out of affects. Remember, Jung said the basic core of my theory, of our theory, is affect. So trauma is built out of affect images, and affect images become the little building blocks of our dreams. They show up in our dreams with strong feeling and the defenses against them. So a complex is a strong feeling and a defense against that feeling. That's what splits it off from the regular ego. So in a way, I was very indebted to Jung for this whole idea that, there are defenses against certain affects that come up that form our complexes. But Jung did not contemplate the level of trauma that, Debbie, you were talking about, that you were blown away by. For Jung, it was as though the trauma he was working with were affects that could be remembered, that were painful, that became part of the shadow personality, that were defended against. But they were not traumatic affects that could completely disorganize the personality. And that's what we find in severe cases of dissociation. So there's a range. I mean, with certain patients, we're working with complexes, and those are more mature psyches, and the trauma has occurred later in life. With certain patients, we're working with more serious levels of trauma. And so I've talked about a core complex of the traumatized psyche in early childhood. That's been the subject of recent articles. So
I also want to go back to the story that you told about the client who watched that film of herself receiving no comfort at age 2. And just to highlight that trauma can be horrible emotional neglect as well as overt punitive or hostile actions on the part of others, because this is what that client experienced all the time.
That's right.
Not just at a wedding, but imagine the coldness of no one picking up that child and someone simply filming it.
Yeah.
So such a remarkable and pervasive lack of empathy.
Yeah, I mean, Ernest Wolf, who was an old collaborator of Heinz Kohut back in the day, used to talk about the trauma of unshared emotionality. And a lot of the trauma that comes to me for help is, the person doesn't have any memories. They talk about how they had a great childhood. And this woman said the same thing. And in fact, she had a great childhood. She was riding horses at age 11. Her father bought her a horse. Everything was fine. But her emotional life was never received, never echoed, never got any playback. And consequently, it receded. It went into the unconscious and there was protected by very strong defenses. I mean, the child in her lived in a fortress of very powerful defenses.
Don,
Mm-hmm.
if I may, I'm interested in sort of running something past you, because I've certainly had those people that, came into my practice who had these stories about, oh yeah, everything was great. There was nothing overt, but it just sort of feels like something's really wrong. And as a way of getting at that, I've come to sometimes say, if you ask someone, well, did your parents love you? Oh yeah, they loved me, But sometimes if you say, did you feel that your parents enjoyed you? You get a very different response.
That's right. That's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think that so I'm thinking about your unshared emotionality, and just the way that we're sort of wired to take pleasure in each other. And laughing together and playing together are actually, part of how we attach. I think Winnicott said something about we need to be enjoyed as well as loved, but it's also something that seems for me in my practice to kind of pierce that. It's like if you can remember, if you ask someone that question and they sort of smile and they say, yeah, I always had a way of cracking my mom up or something like that. I think Chagall's mom said something like, or maybe it was Chagall who said, my mother had a lot of trouble with me and I think she enjoyed it. That sort of feeling
Right.
is so very different than the bereft look that many people get when I ask them that question.
Well, I think you're putting your finger right on something that's crucially important, and that's the issue of play. I mean, Winnicott was very keen on this. He said that the child comes into being through the playful interchange and playback with the parent, either parent. But the word that I frequently find myself using is celebration.
That's lovely.
Were you celebrated?
Yeah.
Did your mother or father throw you up in the air in the pool? And did you play games together? Did you have any fun?
Did you walk in the room and your mother's face lit up? At least some of the time.
Yeah, some of the time, not all the time. God forbid. None of us got parented like that. But yes, so we grow on those moments. That's the nature, as you said, of human attachment and growth and self-esteem. And if we don't have that feeling, if we don't ignite a response in people that we depend on and care about ourselves, then we discover that there's something that dies inside. We can't fully be alive to ourselves. I'm a couple of people that I've worked with in this early trauma story remember where they were sitting on the playground when they realized they couldn't play.
Oh.
They didn't know how to play. They couldn't join the other kids because they didn't know what to do.
I'm thinking about how this shows up often in our consulting rooms as a person that feels he or she has to do something to earn another person's approval, love, etc. Of working extra hours without pay, thinking about people, bringing gifts, being the one to organize family celebrations and parties. The people have to earn their way instead of what we would hope every child has, which is that just delight because you're there.
Well, exactly, Deb. And, there's been a lot of writing about this. Bernard Brandschaft wrote about what he called pathological accommodation. Winnicott said that the false self is based on compliance, whereas the true self is based on the spontaneous gesture, which is received. So, that's absolutely right. When we grow up in those kinds of environments, we feel that we don't, deep inside the self, there's not a sense of being valuable or worthwhile. As a matter of fact, shame creeps in, and we start to feel about ourselves that there's something wrong, something defective. We don't know what it is. We can't even articulate that we feel ashamed. We just know that something is wrong. We're not right. We're not quite right. And we have to, therefore, perform. So a lot of these early trauma patients will have extraordinary resumes of accomplishment in the outer world. They will have found ways to distinguish themselves. I mean, if they happen to be extremely bright or extremely beautiful or talented in one way or another, they often find their way to distinguish themselves and find a way to make quite a contribution. And we have to be very careful here. Trauma survivors who are devastated by their early experience can be extremely accomplished and people in the world and in the society and make huge contributions, whether it's artists or physicians or whatever. We have to be careful because people have a trauma history in the emotional sphere. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't have a full life. The problem comes in their intimate relationships always, in their marriages or in their connections to people. That's where they start to have trouble, and that's almost always where they encounter things that drive them into therapy. I'll never forget a great big 240-pound football coach who came to see me on recommendations of his wife because he had just had his second child who had a condition of jaundice and it wasn't clear what the prognosis was. And this man's little boy became an obsession. He would stand over his crib every night trying to keep him awake and alive, just with his caring, crying and crying and crying. He had no awareness that he had any traumatic past. But as we started to unpack it, he was raised by this very militaristic father who beat him practically into unconsciousness with his belt. He had a constant chronic problem in school for which he was shamed and humiliated. And as we started to unpack his own personal history, then he started to be able to shift his overweening love for this young boy in himself from his own actual son to his own inner child. And then the family relationships started to clear up, and so did he. But so we get in touch with these things through what people carry for us in projection.
Yes, in this topic of how important the relationship between the analyst and the analysand is, being a psychopomp, validating and introducing themselves to their own history and inviting affect to come back. I was struck by your first story when you were moved to tears by what your client had said. And I was thinking of a story that Marion Woodman used to tell, that she had been in an analysis for quite some time, and she thought it was going well enough. And then one day she came into her analysis to say that her dog had died, her pet had died, and she just had no affect around it. And her analyst began to sob, just sob almost uncontrollably. And when he could kind of catch his breath, he said that this was your soul pet. And at that point, Marion's this enormous repressed affect kind of volcanically rose up in her. And she says that that actually was the first day of her analysis. That's where it began. And so I thought maybe we could talk more about this process of the analyst participating in the affective field so poignantly, because I think there are many different clinical models and clinical ideas about what analysts should or shouldn't evidence during a session.
Oh, that's such a great point, Joseph. Let's talk about that, because those are extremely moving moments, right? And as a matter of fact, I don't know how that moment was described by Marion, but it wouldn't surprise me if the word numinous came in there. And this will give me a segue into how I happened to write my second book, because trauma is an injury to the capacity to feel. That's maybe the most important sentence I will say today. As a matter of fact, Henry Russell, who was an analyst in Boston, used to say that all psychopathology that comes to me for attention is the scar tissue of the injury of the capacity to feel. Now, what does that mean? That means that our feelings are the important parts of our own evolution and development that must be honored, echoed, developed. You know, the buzzword in the field is affect tolerance, affect competence, emotional intelligence. All of these things try to get at the fact that trauma is an injury to the capacity to feel. Well, what that means is defenses come in to cut us off from our feelings so that the injury is not repeated. And those defenses, dissociation, are very effective. And apparently Marion Woodman had very effective defenses, because our animals are about as close as we can get often to feelings of our own innocence, our own pre-traumatic vitality, our own vital spark, if you will, our own soul lives. You know, Jung's basic idea was that we are all deep inside us, lying somewhere dormant, like a seed, is the potential wholeness of the self. And that seed will spring to growth around certain experiences and moments, and our love for our animals is one of the places where we're going to find that soul image coming up and being carried by a beloved animal. I mean, we just got a new Maine Coon cat who's, I don't know whether you've ever seen a Maine Coon cat, but we had one, and we're grieving her loss for a year, and so we went and got Sammy. And Sammy is currently still a kitten and tearing the house apart. But I mean,
Don, we need to see her. We need to see her.
I'm not sure that's going to be possible. She's very hard to catch. I'm here to tell you, she literally can leap from the floor to a very high dresser in one little bound. But you know, the feelings of love that come up around a pet, around, you know, a wild creature that happens to just, you know, be full of vinegar and trouble and affection and all those things that early children, not early children, children in general, infants are full of. So, Joseph, back to your point, I think the reason that I got so powerfully compelled into this area of early trauma was that, like that moment of tears with my patient, there were moments that opened in the sessions usually when we got through some defenses, and believe me, I'm here to tell you that after 50 years of analytic training and work, I'm only beginning to understand and to know how not to collude with my patient's defenses. That means defenses that, I have certain patients that just love to talk. And because they know me well, they will run their program about their week and about what's going on as long as I let them. But if I slow them down and say, let's just stop for a moment and just sink into what you're feeling right now and pay attention to what you came in wanting today. Where do you feel it in your body? What that does is take them out of their self-care system and into the moment, into their affect, more likely. Sometimes they can get there, sometimes not, but it will take them into the moment, and the moment is where we all happen to be living, including those of us who are having this conversation, right? We're not living in the past, we're not living in the future, we're living right here, right now. And so in the therapy moment, if people can, and it takes great courage to do this, and training and experience to be able to, as Pema Chodron says, let your heart break and drop the story. To the extent that people can do that, it's very moving. And in my experience, it's not only moving, it's a numinous moment. Not always, but there are moments when we are moved by something that happens when a part of the psyche that has long been banished and orphaned and exiled comes home again. And we have the privilege of witnessing it. It just fills us with gratitude, and we need to promote those moments. I mean, you can't have them all the time. We've got to talk about the week's problems, and we got to schmooze, and we've got to, make sure that we feel safe enough with this person called a therapist in order to risk those moments of openness and heartfelt openness. But this is one of my hobby horses these days, is how we who practice in the Jungian vein need to rekindle and reconnect to emotion, to affect in the sessions and in our patients. And we need to do so partly because we've been led away from affect into image. We Jungians are great with images. We compare them. We talk about archetypal images. Hillman says, stick with the image. That's true, by the way. If you're having an emotion you don't know what to do with and you stick with the image, you oftentimes get an affect image. But we can forget that the heart centers where our affects are, where our feelings are the real royal road to healing. And consequently, I've been giving talks and webinars more about the heart and ways of accessing affect when defenses are in the picture. Because defenses don't want us to have our affects. And Jung had a lot of those defenses. If you read the Red Book, you discover a lot of the images and a lot of the active imaginations with those images. It's not always easy to find your way to the affects that are underneath those images or implied by those images or embedded in those images. The Red Book to me is an absolutely fabulous record of something that Jung discovered, which is central to his whole work, and that is active imagination. He discovered, that in his despair and in his brokenness, he listened for 28 days to the voices of mockery down in his study, unable to feel, unable to think, no images, nothing. And then he picked up his pen and he said, my soul, where are you? Meine Seele, where are you? And that was his first act of active imagination. He opened to what was going on. And the first image that came back to him was that of a child. And if you want to read it, you can read it in the Red Book and in the Black Books. Who are you, child, he says. And then he realizes that child is none other than the child that lived in God's world when he was younger and played on the lakeshore and made castles in the sand and was connected to nature, and that he had forsaken that child and gone off to live the spirit of the times. And now he was connecting to the spirit of the depths, and the avatar of the spirit of the depths was the child. And it wasn't only any child. It was a divine child. It was a child that lived between two worlds. You know, Jung says, the main moments in my life that really matter are the moments when the imperishable world erupted into this transitory one. That was such a moment. The imperishable world. So he became quite convinced that the world that he had forsaken, the world of God's world, the world of his dreams, the world of that child, that alive, animated, leaping, jumping child, crying child also, that he had lost it, and now his soul is returning. So, and what he paid out to us in his own suffering thereafter is all about what he discovered, because he discovered that if you situate yourself in that space between the two worlds, that's where the imagination is, that's where creativity is, that's where our mutual tears are. Because those two worlds are between the ego and the unconscious, between the eternal and time, between kairos and chronos. They're also between self and other. So we're always in between, and if we're not in between, we need to work to get in between. Winnicott made his whole authorship about intermediate space. For him, the magic space was between mother and baby. For Jung, the magic space was between ego and self. They don't occur without each other.
Mm-hmm.
Jung made feeling one of his function types.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that isn't right, but on the other hand, what I'm suggesting is that feeling is something that is crucially important to all of us across the board. We don't get to not feel because we're not a feeling type. We have to make ourselves aware that when we can drop into our feeling selves, it frequently makes us feel very weak, very vulnerable, but it's the key to healing.
Don, one of the things that I'm so appreciating is, first of all, your discussion of defenses, which Jung didn't talk about them in that way so much. And it seems to me that just in my own sort of work and trying to understand my psyche and those of my analysans, that it is pretty crucial to understand defenses, and the way that the object relationists talk about them, as you've already alluded, is really, really helpful. And they did do more in this area than Jung. But also, you're specifying that what we're talking about are defenses against feeling.
Yeah.
That it's that specifically. And I couldn't agree more as I'm trying to make sense of things, that this is so critical to what blocks us.
Yeah. How did we lose this?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it reminds me of a saying by Confucius, the way out is through the door. Why is it that so few people use this method?
Yeah.
Well, the relationship between our inner worlds, our inner feelings, and our outer defenses, which we need desperately in order to get along in the world, is so crucial to an understanding of what ails us. Right now, we have descended as a nation into a world of defenses.
Yeah.
And without getting into those or the illusions that support them, it's mostly because we don't want or can't allow ourselves to feel the trouble we're in, the planet we're burning up,
Yeah.
the kids we're killing,
Mm-hmm.
the women that we're persecuting after Roe, after you're overturning a Roe. I mean, it's like we are so averse and led by an ex-president who can't go anywhere near the feeling of losing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like kryptonite to his Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the feelings we would rather not have. And so lately I've done some webinars about trying to apply this trauma theory about feeling and defenses against feeling to the national situation. But I don't want to get us distracted because we could go down a rabbit hole here, and I would rather not.
Maybe we can go a little down the rabbit hole, because I do also see this in the culture, in this expectation that seems to exist out there, that we should never feel anything uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it's really kind of getting instantiated in the culture, these defenses against feeling. Like, if you feel uncomfortable, here's a pill you can take. And I'm not, this is not a screed against medication, but I do see this attitude where people come into my office and it's like something's wrong because I felt uncomfortable. And it's like, well, where did you get the feeling that you wouldn't ever feel uncomfortable?
Well, it's such a big topic, and we could spend the rest of our time together on it. But let me just say that this is one of the perversions, or corruptions of trauma theory. We have this idea of trauma, and God forbid that we should feel traumatized by what somebody says on a college campus that disagrees with our position. So we need safe zones, and we need comfort animals, and we need, to cancel. Cancel, by the way, cancel culture, that is dissociation.
Oh, gosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, if ever there were an outer example of dissociation, cancel culture is it. So, yeah, we have to be, this is the shadow side of all this work that we've been doing and what we've exposed and the healing that has happened. Now we are at a point where it's been politicized and polarized, and now the idea is, if you feel pain, you should get somebody fired, or cancel a speaker or whatever you need to do.
Right. This concept creep around the idea of harm.
Yeah.
Harm has become absorbed more and more and more and more. So now I'm uncomfortable means harm, or I disliked what you said and I'm left in some kind of intellectual quandary, and that's become harm.
Yeah.
So this fantasy that it's so easy to harm us, which is, I think, problematic in and of itself, and then misnaming things to then justify attacking them.
Exactly, Joseph. It's we've entered a space now where do no harm, and I understand that. We do need to be more sensitive. This is the positive side of this whole movement. But any democracy requires, and by the way, the psyche is a democracy. We are made up of different parts that are in constant conflict with each other. And if we don't have broad shoulders and a big enough ego to hold that conflict, then guess what happens? We dissociate, we split off the uncomfortable part of it, project it onto somebody else, and then attack them. That's the basic understanding of shadow work, and Jung did a great deal to help us understand how important that is. If we want a functioning democracy, then we are going to have to get uncomfortable with each other. And that means disagreeing, that means having aversive reactions. Jung said once about his Swiss democracy, he says, everybody thinks of Switzerland as peaceful, but we have a democracy here where we all hate each other. And we all hate each other and try to kill each other within the rules and boundaries of elections. That's called a democracy. And then we go out for a drink after the election, because we all realize we're parts of the same culture, we're parts of the same nation. That's what we're tending to lose in America. Because one final thing, and then I'll stop. The basic idea of the Declaration of Independence is that all men and women are created equal. Well, what does that mean? For Jung, that meant we're all little teeny minor facets of the divine one. So we're equal because we're sacred. We lose that in a projective, splitting culture because we dehumanize each other. I think Jung had a great deal to say that supports democracy, the particular unique and I think precious American version of it, by the way, supports it from the bottom up with an understanding of what is required to be creative, to grow, to allow for internal differences and the conflict of feelings that are inside us.
So I find myself thinking about the hard work of a democracy, whether that's in our civilization or whether it's in the psyche, which suggests that all parts of the psyche get to cast a vote, get to make themselves known.
Right.
And I'm thinking about how laborious, how much effort, how much life force it takes to tend that democratic dynamic inwardly and outwardly. So when I'm thinking about the labor of that, again, I go back to one of the images in your trauma model, and I believe this is mostly talked about in your first book, The Inner World of Trauma. You use the metaphor of having to descend into the underworld, into the hell of our psyche, ideally with a psychopomp of one kind or another, and having to encounter, as you said, this cut-off affect and to suffer ourselves, to suffer the truth of ourselves. And then there at the end, there's finally a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a sense there's a door. There's finally a door. My analysis might come to an end, or I'm going to be healed. And as they approach the door in this metaphor, we see this enormous body of the devil, which you brilliantly reminded us is called dis, D-I-S, connecting it to dissociation, dismemberment, the breaking apart. And that the person seeking healing has to metaphorically rise up through the body of dis in order to escape through the door at the top.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been captured by this image of the labor of having to go through the body of dis to get finally out the door. And I'm wondering what that corresponds to in terms of psychospiritual work, what that looks like. How could someone both imagine that process and then feed themselves enough courage to be able to do it?
Oh, it's such a great question, Joseph. Reminds me of something Jung said, which I won't be able to get completely properly quoted, but somewhere he said, if you really want to know what this is about, it's like having a Last Supper with yourself and eating your own flesh and drinking your own blood and recognizing that the dark one is in you. That is such a powerful image of what. Let me say a little bit about the image that you're talking about, because back around the time that after I wrote my first book and before the second, I knew, was good friends with actually two Jungian analysts in New York. One was named Charles Taylor. The other was Patricia Finley. And they were now a couple, and they wrote a book called Images of the Journey in Dante's Divine Comedy. And I had become interested in imagery of Hades because I began to think, I wonder if images of hell aren't maybe an outpicturing of the unconscious of a trauma survivor. In other words, Dante, in his midlife crisis, he's depressed, and Beatrice, his love, looks down from heaven and sees that he's depressed and realizes, well, this guy needs a descent into hell. A homeopathic remedy. Take a little bit of this thing that bites you, right? So she says, okay, now if we look at that psychologically, what that means is Dante has to go into all his unremembered pain and look it in the eye and confront it. He can't do this alone, so he recruits a partner, his favorite poet, Virgil, to go in with him. Now, Virgil happens to live, guess where? In Hades, in the outermost layer of hell, in what's called limbo. And by the way, I'll say as an aside here, back in around 1979, I wrote a paper for Quadrant, I think, called Limbo and the Lost Soul in Psychotherapy. And I had no idea what I was writing about, but I had gotten out of seminary, and I got interested in the fact that there's a whole liturgy and history called the harrowing of hell. And I didn't know this, but maybe you did. But in the Christian tradition, when you say the Apostles' Creed, you say he descended into hell. And for 3 days he, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the medieval theologians made a great deal of that, and they made a whole story about how Christ descended into hell and had to fight with the devil and open the crypt and let out the captured souls. And among the captured souls were people like Virgil and the righteous patriarchs and people who had lived before Christ. And guess what? Children.
Unbaptized children.
Unbaptized children. They didn't know what to do. The medieval imagination, this is a trauma psychology if ever there was one, didn't know what to do with children because instead of original blessing, we have this strange idea of original sin. So they had to put the children in hell. So they put them in the outermost layer of hell, which is called limbo. So in my second book, I go into hell and I follow Virgil and Dante all the way into hell, all the way down through the 9 circles. It's a great image for our lost, unremembered pain. It's like under successive layers of repression and dissociation. And so when you get down to the very bottom, can you imagine my excitement when through Pat and Charlie's book, I discovered that the Lord of the Underworld is named Dis? I mean, wow. You can't make this stuff up. So I then talked about this iconography, and in Dante's story, there's only one way out of the 9th circle where he confronts Dis, which is who's a 3-headed monster devouring one sinner in each of his gaping maws, and he has this hideous hairy body with feathers and horns and disgusting qualities. And in Dante's language, if you go down all the way to the core of the earth, the only way out is through the southern hemisphere. So everything has to then be turned upside down. So the way out of the deepest, darkest hell of our trauma histories is up through purgatory. And in order to get up through purgatory, you have to go down the body of Dis, and you have to climb up the legs until you exit. And that's the image that you're talking about, Joseph. But the work of really grappling with the devil in yourself, this is shadow work, right? It's the places where those defenses have gotten a hold of you and turned you into a zealot. And where you really have to, here's a great quote from Jung, where you really have to find a humble core of your suffering self. Jung, during his 40s, when he was collaborating with Freud to create psychoanalysis, he wrote Freud that full of excitement. And here's Jung. I mean, this is the best of Jung. He said, my God, we've got the whole key to mythology and to the unconscious. This should be our new religion. And Freud wrote back and said, my dear Jung, in you the tempest rages. We are scientists. We're not in business to create a new religion. But Jung's letter was quite rhapsodic, and I loved it because it was so full of his excitement. So fast forward 50 years, and some student of Jung sends him that very letter and the correspondence. And Jung says, oh my God. He says, many thanks for that accursed correspondence. And then he goes on to say, Pilgrim's Progress for me was a long, slow process. The journey from Cloud Cuckoo Land meant climbing down 1,000 ladders until I could reach out my hand to the little cloud of earth that I am. Now, it took him 83 years to say that, but he had done his work. He'd been there and back.
So maybe this takes us to, how do we do this work of a journey that doesn't sound all that appealing down through all those layers of hell to the hairy, clawed, feathered, egregious creature. So maybe part of it starts with, okay, I guess I've got to go there. And then the next part is how.
Mm-hmm.
and whether, a psychoanalytic journey is the only way, or whether all roads lead to Rome in some way, and what might all those roads be.
Well, Deb, that's a great segue into the work we do, which is, among other things, dream work. When we do trauma work in the Jungian vein, we try to attend to what the psyche is saying. Now, let me introduce an idea that you probably haven't heard much about, and that is that not all dreams are interpretable. Because of dissociation and dismembering defenses, some dreams are simply stuttering outer images. I remember when I learned this from a patient who I asked her to bring in her dreams, and she thought I meant the moments that she had before sleep where she would imagine singing in front of an audience of appreciative people who loved and adored her, and she thought that was her dream. That's what I meant by asking her to bring in her dreams, and so she brought those in. When she started to have what I would think of as sort of more autonomous night dreams, they were all in stick figures, no affect. Then she came in one day after we continued to hold this process, and she was so full of excitement. She said, I had a dream. I know what you mean now. And she dreamt of, I forget what the dream was, but it was a dream such as we would consider a normal dream. There was a plot, there was tension, there was a resolution or not. There were people in the dream, there were animals in the dream, it was what I would call a mature dream. Now, a mature dream is when affect and image have had a chance to link up with each other. A dreamer who cannot feel yet feelings may dream dreams, but we will be frustrated because they will not lead to affect, or if the patient is in an intensified affect state, say a panic of anxiety or despair or whatever, it won't lead to images. But when the psyche starts to be potentiated, and that usually happens when therapy begins, the person who is suffering alone brings his or her process into the field, and something happens that quickens the flow of psyche, and affect and image start to link up. And so we get dreams that tell us, what amazed me is that they start to tell us about the defensive process and what is being defended. Now, if you don't have an understanding of the fact that the psyche can outpicture defenses and the feeling content that is being defended, then you'll miss this. So that's why, I call it a hobby horse. I'm so keen to get people that are in training at our various institutes to pay attention to the feelings in the session, the feelings that are caught in a hellish fortress of dissociation, feelings in the dream, because the dream, various trauma theorists say, well, the defenses of trauma, dissociation attacks the symbolic capacity and renders it useless. That's true until the field of the psyche is potentiated. Then we get the psyche having the capacity to symbolize the anti-symbolic forces. What a miracle the psyche is. Now, this doesn't help us all the time, but usually the dreams will start to intimate some vulnerable part of the wholeness of the person's life that is injured. Sometimes it'll be, I remember one woman who had a reputation all over Westchester County of rescuing animals that were almost roadkill, but not quite. And she would take them to vets. And so the vets knew her as the animal lady, and she would bring in broken turtles and run over snakes and, fawns with their front legs broken off. And, she was amazing. And in her dreams, what started to happen were injured animals. This woman was a terror with her husband. I mean, she was a tyrant. And she did not suffer fools gladly, but when it came to animals, she dedicated herself to relieving the pain and the suffering of these animals. She couldn't get to the point of She once appeared in my waiting room and said she couldn't have her session. And I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, there's a pigeon downstairs. This was 34 floors down. And the women were feeding the pigeons in the building. And she said, there's a pigeon with a broken wing, and you have to do something. You have to do something. We have to do something. I made the mistake of saying, you're kidding.
Ugh.
That created an eruption of rage and outrage, which I rapidly understood. And so I went inside. I got a box. I even got some breadcrumbs, and we went down together and rescued this pigeon and gave it to the doorman and had the rest of the session with the pigeon safely in a box with the doorman. I don't remember the rest of the session. I think I was in such shock that I'd probably have repressed it. But I don't know that that woman ever came to the point of feeling her own. Yeah, we did get there. We did get there, but it took a long time.
But it's such a powerful story of bringing what had to be enacted as if it was out there.
That's right.
Inside and into a personal feeling realm, and then being able to be symbolized in dream images.
That's right.
So bringing it back in.
Yeah, and she needed to see that her therapist was willing to go there.
Yep.
I was offended that she would prefer to, spend her hour with the pigeon than with me. And I had to get over it.
That story and my own clinical experiences reminds me of the attempt to destroy the analyst, raging because you didn't align with her value around the pigeon, raging or hatred because the analyst is facilitating this reconnection to affect or reconnection to dissociated memories, that the internal defenses decide that the analyst is the problem.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you dance with that.
Well, dance is a good word for it. I rarely have been attacked in that way, like I was attacked in that moment with the pigeon lady. In that instance, for example, I think what she was picking up was my own defenses, and she was aware that she couldn't live with them. It was only when I dropped them and showed him her human dimension that she could relate to me at that point, separate from her own defenses. I mean, she was completely identified. By the way, this is something, when we have these archaic archetypal defenses, the problem with them is not that they're there. The problem is we identify the ego with them. And then we become enraged, or we become the bright angel in the system and go out and rescue all the animals. We become inflated with their archetypal energy. But we don't know we have that identification. We just think that's us. So the identification with defenses is something that needs to be separated slowly. And dancing with it is the crucial element. And, the only way to dance with it that seems to work is to get in touch with our own vulnerability when we're attacked, our own hurt feelings.
We have to model it.
Yeah, we have to go there instead of getting,
Without retaliating
or without, saying, well, that's not my responsibility. This is analysis and you can't do that here. That's an unreasonable request and I'm not going to, there are times when we need to hold the line, but when we're coming to these, this is what Russell talked about as the crunch. He said there will be moments in the therapy when the patient will stage the early trauma in the transference. And everything will depend on that moment and how you respond to it. He said that the difficult things about these crunch moments, enactments we call them now, is that it usually requires the therapist to go the extra mile, to go beyond analytic training. Good analytic training did not prepare me for this, because if I had been, a good, solid, clear boundaried analyst, I never would have gotten a box and bread for that pigeon. I don't think. I mean, maybe I have a caricature of what a good boundaried analyst is supposed to be, but basically, there was not a lot of room in my analysis with with Edward Edinger, who I have deep gratitude for, but he was a very sort of by the book analytic practitioner, and I didn't test him like I've been tested by some of these patients.
It seems to me that in a way, although there's so much more we could discuss, that we've come around full circle in a sense to the thread of feeling, of affect, and how crucial it is. And dreams intrapsychically inside clients and basically all of us, and in the therapeutic process.
That's right.
That heart, as it turns out, really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. An informed heart is what we're looking for. That's Bettelheim's word and book by that title. He survived one of the concentration camps, and he said what he was looking for all the time was an informed heart.
And maybe we can bring what I hope are our informed hearts to a dream.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Our dreamer is a 31-year-old male who works as an attorney. And here's his dream. I enter my parents' kitchen where a group of people are ready to cook lion meat for me to eat. I'm not sure who the cooks are. They show me the different ways they can cook the lion's meat, minced, in a stew, steak, or raw, kind of sashimi style. Afterwards, they show me a mask made of the lion's face, which I have to wear after I eat the lion's meat. I never get to actually eat the meat or wear the lion's mask in the dream. He adds as context, I've been in a place shrouded by self-doubt. Am I good enough? Smart enough? Am I going to be able to achieve the goals I've set myself? It's just been a year of self-examination and study to learn who I am and where I want to go. He notes that he really didn't want to eat lion meat, as he thought it was gross, but felt that he had a duty to eat it. He adds that his parents' house, childhood house, and the lion meat he associates with courage, self-confidence, and strength.
Okay, well, this is a great dream to talk about. The first thing we need to say is to remember what Jung said that he did whenever he approached a dream, which is to say, I know absolutely nothing about what this dream means. Okay, and to put that up like a sign over the doorway of approaching the dream, because it's impossible not to get a sense of what the dream means. At least it is for me now after 50 years of doing this. So I think I know what this dream is about, but I don't.
We have to cultivate humility.
Cultivate humility, that's right. The second thing is to say that we have to be very careful because we don't have the dreamer here. And consequently, we don't have an active conversation with the dreamer about his, in this case, his associations. We have some of his associations, but a great deal will emerge only after that dialogue and in dialogue with the patient. So there is no correct interpretation to a dream. A dream is an ambiguous stimulus that we try to play with. And it's the process of the play that's the healing part, not the insight or the conclusion about what the dream means. Meaning is not the issue here. It's the process of playing with the dream images and the patient's association. So we're not going to be able to play. I mean, we can try, but without the dreamer here, we're not going to have that dialogue play that would lead to a better sense of the aha moment. You know, if you're in the process of that kind of play with a dream, the patient usually has a sense of what the dream is about by the end of it. They'll say, okay, I think this is about this. And that's as far as you can go. So let's just summarize what this dream is about. The parent's kitchen, which is a very psychoactive place, probably. I'd want to know all about what that place felt like. And a group of people that he doesn't know are preparing to cook meat for him to eat. And he doesn't know who they are, but he does feel it's his duty to eat the meat. I'd want to know, tell me about yourself and duty. Where do you feel that you have a duty? So those are just some preliminary things. Now they show me the different ways that they can cook lion's meat. It can be minced, stew, steak, sashimi style, where it would be eaten raw. And then they show me this mask of the lion's face, which I have to wear after I eat the lion's meat. And I never get to actually eat the meat or wear the lion's mask in the dream. Okay, I never get to. That's a passive way of saying it, right? We also hear that he doesn't want to eat the lion's meat because he says it's gross. I would ask him, okay, I want to know all about you and gross. What do you consider gross? What is it about this prospect that feels gross to you? So as you can see, I'm entering the space by trying to open the subjective experience of the dreamer of the dream. You know, what does it feel like to be in this dilemma? You're being asked to do this by people you don't know. What is your feeling? You feel it's your duty to eat it. Well, how did that get to be your duty? Who are they, and how did they get lined up with duty? So you find this a gross thing to be asked of you, and you're resisting it. What does that feel like? Does that remind you of anything? Does it remind you of anything in this kitchen? So those are the keys that I would bring to the dream. Now, let's say something about the archetypal structure of the dream and the content of the dream. The lion he recognizes as associated with courage, self-confidence, and strength. I'd want to know what those qualities mean to him. Does he feel like he has them? Does he feel like he needs them? Does he feel like it would be a good idea if he could get some of these qualities under his belt, so to speak? If he said, yeah, I really do feel without courage, and oftentimes my courage deserts me, and I find myself unable to really do the things I know I need to do to improve myself, like I drink too much, or, you know, if he were to say that, then I might think, well, maybe what the dream is intimating then is that eating the meat of the lion would be an image of taking on some of the lion's qualities, of taking on some of the courage. This is the archetype of the meal, the animal. You know, in early cultures, it's understood that you eat the meat of the animal, whether it's the tongue of the buffalo or whatever, because it gives you the power of the animal. There's also this peculiar imagery of almost like a communion meal, as if the animal has sacrificed itself. I'm making this up now, to be imbibed by the neophyte or the dreamer, in order to get something of that God inside the self, to get the ego and self connected in some way. That's the Christian ritual of the communion service. And cooking, of course, that brings in the whole alchemical dimension. That has to do with preparation. There's something about these people who are willing to prepare this for him. And cooking is usually a way of taking raw meat and making it more assimilable, more attractive, more human in a certain way. Although there is a raw alternative here in the sashimi style. One would be tempted to look at this dream. Well, let's take one extreme, okay? And with the proviso that this is not necessarily what this dream means. Could it be that the self, capital S, his potential wholeness, is sending him this dream and the cooks to help him to take on some qualities that he needs to break through the what he complains of as his lostness, or did he say he was lost?
Self-doubt.
Self-doubt, yeah. To help him to claim some of his essential selfhood, because the lion, after all, is the king of beasts, right? The king is the great individual in archetypal culture. So if you take on the king's energy, you're taking on something of that preeminent, potentially archetypal, transpersonal dimension of the self, and you're taking it into yourself. That means you may be fortifying your ego from below with lion stuff. Mm-hmm. And that could very well be an important thing for him to do, especially if we were able to affirm with the help of the patient that this gross reaction was maybe something not to be trusted.
Right.
Now, let me give you the other side of this dream. This dream could be dreamed by his perfectionistic defenses. Now, what would that say? That would mean that the avatars of duty, of perfectionism, that are always kicking him around and making him feel like shit, have now cooked up another meal for him. He's now duty-bound to do this, even though he doesn't want to, and it doesn't really represent his primary instinctive selfhood. So in that case, the benefit would be in resisting the dream's imprimatur, right? Now, we never know whether the dream is being sent by the self or the defenses. So we always have to be open. I've had dreams that were just channeled by the demonic defense. And the dreamer felt just completely under the spell and overwhelmed and dutiful and sacrificing and all the rest of it. I don't think that's what this dream is. I'm inclined to think, maybe because I have a certain identification with this man's dilemma, and I like lions, to think that that this is very conceivably a gift that this man might be able to benefit from in terms of
eat the lion.
Yeah, eat the lion. Right.
Yeah, I mean, John, I think you've put your finger exactly on the kind of dilemma with looking at a dream like this and wondering kind of which attitude to take toward it. And of course, it would depend so much on the quality of that childhood kitchen, the quality, he said his association with the kitchen was childhood. Well, what about that? What was childhood like? I mean, I could make up, as for your kind of second interpretation, I mean, being a lawyer by the time you're 31, mm-hmm. you probably were on some path there. You went to undergraduate, you applied to law school. Sometimes that path is one that's sort of encouraged or given to us by our parents. Mm-hmm. And so here he is. It sounds like he's having some doubts about, I don't know if he's having doubts about being a lawyer. He's certainly having some self-doubt. And is it time to revisit the meal that has been offered by the parental complexes, perhaps? Mm-hmm. Or are the ancestors giving him soul food? Giving him soul food, exactly. And the animal, by the way, is always sacred. That's a big statement, but we have to remember that. Yeah. So we might ask the dreamer, who killed this lion? Can you imagine the killing of this lion? And for what purpose was the lion killed? Was it killed by these
this group of people in order to provide a meal? I mean, he's making it up. But, I don't like that idea of killing the lion for my food. I don't think that's a good idea. You'll get a lot of information about how he relates to the lion stuff by asking questions around the dream.
I'm also thinking about something that Jung had written. What is the necessary task which the patient will not accomplish? And so in the dream, if we think of it as having a useful telos, the task is to cook and eat the lion, which he does not accomplish in the dream and may not choose to accomplish. So even though he's an attorney, which is quite an achievement, it's an enormous process to become an attorney, and he may think that his task is, to deal with self-doubt and whether or not he's smart enough or good enough. But underneath that, there's that deeper question, which is, what are you avoiding? What is the task that you're avoiding? And if I take the mythic task, not so much as killing the lion, because the lion's already been killed, you just have a hunk of meat there in the kitchen, that part's over, which is his relationship to metabolizing whatever the lion meat represents.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. What is the task? And we haven't talked about the mask yet. Wearing the mask is becoming the lion. So, and it's doing it symbolically. There's a two-step dance in this dream. One is the eating of the lion meat, which seems to be necessary to wear the mask. And he doesn't get to the mask because he doesn't do the first one.
Right.
Now, does that mean he's avoiding a more differentiated symbolic capacity to actualize himself in his life as taking on some of the lion qualities? It's a very interesting question.
So I have a somewhat different sort of starting point with this dream. And per our discussion earlier, a sense of feeling just in myself of empathy for the dream ego here. And although we often say that the attitude of the dream ego is the least trustworthy attitude, and our dream ego doesn't like any part of this whole scene, I am also wondering about whether there is an element here of the mask as persona, of whether you have to adopt sort of what might be family values and this heroic, solar, king of the beast stance, and whether the meat that he needs to eat might be some other kind of meat altogether. Because there's a polarity here of our dream ego thinking it's gross, and then this duty-bound need to embrace a heroic stance, as if you better pick one or the other. And I would be interested in, and I'm feeling this sense of, wait a minute, let's talk about what you think it takes to be an attorney. How aggressive, perhaps as a litigator, do you have to be? How heroic do you have to be? Or is there another stance between shying off the meat and having to be a lion? That is your true path.
Very worthwhile questions, Deb. And, here we are missing the dreamer's presence.
Yes, we are.
To get some indication of which way we might go with this.
Yeah, by which I mean I'm missing and feeling a sense of, wouldn't it really be great to have him here?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in this vein, one of the things, and Don, you've already alluded to this, is I'm so curious about these cooks. Yeah. They're the only other people in the dream. And he says he doesn't really have a sense of them, but if the dreamer we're here, we might try to play with that. If I were going to suggest that this dreamer do an active imagination, it might be interesting to have a conversation with these cooks.
Oh, great idea.
I think what we're all wondering is, where does this injunction to eat the lion meat come from? What part of the psyche is that coming from? It's a wonderful dream in a way to talk about on the podcast, because it really renders very different results depending on which attitude you take toward it. So it's a wonderful kind of illustration of that.
It really is. And for example, if the cooks were to say, we care about you and we can see where you're pinned and we know that this is good for you, it would be different than if the cooks just said, we got hired by the kitchen downtown to throw this stuff together and we have no connection to you and we couldn't care less what happens to you. These questions always evoke important information that we really need to really address the dream.
But talk about defense. I mean, you've already pointed out this one possibility that it's a dream sort of concocted by the perfectionistic defenses, which I really liked. And I'm also curious about the attitude of the dream ego, that this is gross. Mm-hmm. So is there a sort of a defense against possibly doing something that needs to be done? So
yeah, that's why I would ask him, what's gross? And tell me about gross. Yeah.
The last thing that it brings up for me is the death of the old king. The lion is the king of beasts. This young man is wondering whether the guiding principles or values that have brought him to this moment may no longer fit. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, very, very ancient tradition of executing the old infertile king and somehow assuming the energy into the new king, which suggests the potential of a new path, a new central value that could guide the psyche in the next step.
Yeah, that he might take on by eating the lion. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
But that the lion is dead suggests the guiding principle already has been depotentiated, which may also be playing into this feeling of, I don't know what's going on. Is this the right path? Do I have the capacities?
Good point. Yeah.
The old king that might have been telling him, you're a great lawyer. This is perfect. You're going to make a fortune. Keep going. Mm-hmm. And that voice has kind of hit the chopping block.
Yeah.
So there's something else needs to come up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Well, thank you so much, Don. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and see you. And we all speak regularly about the extraordinary contribution that you've made to us and to our whole field.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity because, you guys are creating a vehicle to get ideas out. And it's a wonderful thing you're doing. And I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to get my ideas out through your podcast. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
And Don, we'd love to have you back on. So maybe after your new book comes out, you'll visit with us again.
Oh,
that's great. That would be wonderful.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.